Elena Vance didn't believe in ghosts, but she spent every morning painting a mask over one. As the CEO of Vance Global, her face was her most valuable asset, a marble facade of competence that signaled to the market that she was untouchable. But as she sat in the back of her town car, the city lights blurring into long ribbons of neon, she felt a phantom weight in her lap that had nothing to do with her leather-bound laptop case. "You have 10 minutes to be a person, Elena," she whispered to her reflection in the darkened window. "Then you go back to being a predator." The Empire of Glass, the headquarters of Vance Global, was a monument to modern ambition, 60 floors of steel and ego. Elena's office sat at the very top, a glass-walled cage where she spent 16 hours a day dissecting the failures of others and turning them into her successes. She was the Iron Empress, a woman who had systematically removed every variable of chaos from her life: no pets, no plants that required watering, and certainly no long-term relationships. Her morning had been typical: a $400 million acquisition of a struggling tech firm, a teleconference with London that ended in 3 resignations, and a lunch of black coffee and adrenaline. By 6 p.m., she was ready to retreat to her silent penthouse, but a reminder popped up on her phone that felt like a localized earthquake. Dinner, Heritage. 8 p.m., don't you dare cancel? The message was from Chloe, her younger sister and the only person who still remembered the Elena who used to laugh until she couldn't breathe. Chloe had spent months orchestrating this blind date with a man named Mark, a software architect who was supposedly the antidote to everything Elena represented. "He's not a shark, Elle," Chloe had insisted during their last lunch. "He's a builder. He creates things. You just buy them." Elena sighed, rubbing her temples. She didn't want a builder. She wanted a silent evening with a spreadsheet. But the guilt of 3 missed birthdays and a dozen canceled Sunday brunches finally outweighed her desire for solitude. The ritual of the mask. Elena's apartment was a study in minimalism: white marble, gray silk, and no photographs. She dressed for the date like she was dressing for a hostile takeover. She chose a sleek black dress that hugged her frame with surgical precision and a diamond necklace that sat against her collarbone like a cold, glittering collar. As she applied her lipstick, a shade called Power Red, she paused. For a fleeting second, she saw a flicker in her own blue eyes that didn't belong to a CEO. It was a shadow from 10 years ago, a memory of a drafty clinic and a choice that had cost her a piece of her soul. She had buried that version of Elena deep beneath the foundations of her company, convinced that success was the only way to silence the what-ifs. "He's just a man, Maya." She stopped herself, her breath hitching. She never said that name aloud. Never. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked out the door, the click of her heels sounding like a countdown. The unscripted arrival. El Heritage was the kind of restaurant where the waiters moved like ghosts and the silverware cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Elena arrived exactly 5 minutes late, a calculated move to ensure she wasn't the one waiting. She saw him immediately. He was sitting in a corner booth, looking decidedly out of place in a dark navy sweater that suggested he valued comfort over optics. He was handsome, yes, but it was a lived-in kind of handsome, with fine lines around his eyes that spoke of real laughter and genuine worry. But as she approached, her professional stride faltered. Mark wasn't alone. Nestled into the velvet cushions beside him was a small girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old. She wore a pale pink dress and held a leather-bound sketchbook against her chest as if it were a shield. "Elena?" Mark stood up, his face flushing with a mix of genuine apology and sheer exhaustion. "I am so incredibly sorry. This is not how I planned this. My sitter's car broke down on the bridge and she's completely stranded. I tried to call your office, but I couldn't get past your assistant." Elena felt the urge to turn and walk out. This was chaos. This was a variable she hadn't accounted for. But as she looked at Mark's earnest, pleading eyes, something in her reinforced steel heart buckled. "It's fine, Mark," she said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "I assume this is the +1 Chloe forgot to mention." "This is Maya," Mark said, ushering the girl forward. "Maya, say hi to Ms. Vance." The mirror in the booth, Maya didn't say hello. She didn't hide behind her father's leg or offer a shy wave. Instead, she stepped forward and looked Elena directly in the eye. The impact was physical. Elena felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. The girl's eyes weren't just blue. They were a startling, piercing sapphire, the exact shade Elena saw in her own reflection every morning. They held a depth of perception that was entirely too heavy for a child. Maya, Elena repeated, the name tasting like ash and honey on her tongue. You have the same necklace, Maya whispered, pointing a small finger at the diamond pendant. It looks like a star that fell down. Elena instinctively reached for the jewelry. It's just a rock, Maya. No, the girl said firmly, sliding into the booth. It's a signal, Mark laughed nervously, sliding in next to his daughter. She has an overactive imagination. She spends most of her time in that sketchbook. I hope you don't mind a dinner guest who draws more than she talks. I prefer it, Elena said, finally sitting down. But as she opened her menu, she realized her hands were shaking. She looked across the table at the man she was supposed to be dating, but her gaze kept drifting to the little girl who sat with the poise of a miniature queen. A symphony of distraction. The first 30 minutes of the dinner were a blur of polite inquiry and low-level chaos. Mark was a software architect who worked for a boutique firm that prioritized ethics over earnings, a concept Elena found quaint but surprisingly refreshing. He talked about the complexities of building systems that actually helped people, and for the first time in years, Elena found herself listening rather than waiting for her turn to speak. However, the true center of gravity was Maya. The girl didn't touch her Shirley Temple. She didn't look at the expensive appetizers. She sat with her sketchbook open, her charcoal pencil scratching rhythmically against the heavy paper. Every few seconds she would glance up at Elena, her eyes narrowing as if she were memorizing the geometry of Elena's face. She's an artist, Mark explained, reaching over to gently nudge Maya's shoulder. Ever since I adopted her, she's been obsessed with drawing faces. She says she's looking for someone she lost a long time ago. Adopted. The word hit Elena like a physical strike. The Iron Empress felt her internal walls begin to crumble. 10 years ago, a terrified 26-year-old, Elena had walked into St. Jude's Home for Children and signed away her rights to a daughter she was told would go to a stable, loving home. She had done it because she believed she was a monster, a woman so consumed by ambition that she would only poison a child's life. She had never looked back. She had never asked for names. She had simply worked until the memory became a dull ache instead of a sharp blade. Where did you find her? Elena asked, her voice dangerously thin. A private agency in the city, Mark said, his voice softening with affection. The moment I saw her, I knew. It wasn't even a choice. It was a recognition. Maya stopped drawing. The scratching of the pencil ceased, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. She looked at Elena, and for a split second, the CEO of Vance Global saw past the pink dress and the charcoal stains. She saw a mirror of her own loneliness, a reflection of a life built on a foundation of what if. I like your face, Maya said suddenly. It's very hard to draw. It has too many secrets on it. Elena forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. All adults have secrets, Maya. Not mine, Maya whispered, her gaze dropping back to her book. Mine is just a secret until I show it to you. As the waiter arrived to take their orders, Elena felt a cold sweat break across her skin. She was sitting across from a man who was kind, a man who was everything she wasn't, and a child who looked like she had been plucked directly from Elena's most guarded nightmares. Part 1 of her evening was supposed to be a simple obligation, a way to appease her sister. Instead, it had become a collision course with a past she thought she had outrun. The amber glow of the restaurant felt increasingly like an interrogation lamp. Elena Vance, a woman who could stare down a boardroom of activist investors without blinking, found herself struggling to maintain eye contact with a 7-year-old. Mark's presence had been a buffer, a warm breeze of normal conversation, but when his phone vibrated against the mahogany table with the insistent buzz of a server room emergency, the air in the booth turned static. I am so sorry, Mark said, his face etched with genuine distress as he looked at the screen. It's the London hub. If I don't authorize this reboot now, the whole system hangs. I'll be 2 minutes just right outside where it's quiet. Go, Elena said, her voice sounding brittle. We'll be fine, as Mark slid out of the booth and hurried toward the heavy oak doors. The silence that crashed down between Elena and Maya was absolute. The background clink of silverware and the low murmur of other diners seemed to recede into a vacuum. The silent standoff Elena reached for her wine glass, her fingers brushing the stem with a tremor she hoped the child wouldn't notice. She took a sip of the vintage Bordeaux, but it tasted like iron. She looked at Maya. The girl hadn't moved. She sat with her back perfectly straight, her hands folded over the cover of her leather-bound sketchbook. "You don't like the pasta?" Elena asked, pointing to the untouched plate of handmade fettuccine. It was a weak attempt at small talk, the kind of human interaction Elena usually delegated to her HR department. "I'm not hungry," Maya said. Her voice wasn't high-pitched or flighty. It had a grounded, rhythmic quality. "I'm busy. Drawing?" Elena asked, leaning in slightly. The CEO in her, the part of her that hunted for data and leverage, was desperate to see what was inside that book. The physical resemblance between them was no longer just a coincidence in Elena's mind. It was a screaming alarm. "I'm not just drawing," Maya corrected her. She looked up, and for a moment, Elena felt as though the girl was reading her heartbeat. "I'm finishing." The unveiling Maya slid the sketchbook across the white linen tablecloth. It moved slowly, almost ceremoniously. The leather was scuffed at the edges, worn by small hands that had clearly carried it everywhere. "My daddy says that when you lose something important, you have to describe it to the police so they can help you find it," Maya whispered. But I didn't have words. I only had lines. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, irregular thud. "What did you lose, Maya?" "I didn't lose her," Maya said, her blue eyes narrowing. "She lost me. But I kept her face in my head so I could recognize her when she finally stopped being busy." Maya flipped the book open. Elena's breath didn't just hitch. It stopped entirely. She felt a cold, prickling sensation sweep from the base of her skull down to her fingertips. It wasn't a child's drawing. It was a charcoal masterpiece, rendered with a level of anatomical precision that was impossible for a 7-year-old and less. That child was driven by an obsession that transcended skill. The woman in the sketch was Elena. It wasn't just a likeness. It was an extraction of her soul. The drawing captured the slight, defensive tilt of her head. It captured the narrowness of her brow when she was thinking. But the detail that made the room spin was located just below the woman's collarbone in the drawing. There, rendered in delicate gray strokes, was a tiny, star-shaped birthmark. Elena's hand flew to her own chest, covering the exact spot beneath her black silk dress where that birthmark sat. She had never shown it to Mark. She had never mentioned it to Chloe. It was her hidden scar, a mark she had shared only with the nurses in a quiet clinic 10 years ago. "How?" Elena gasped, the word barely a puff of air. "Maya, how could you know this?" "I told you," Maya said, her expression remarkably calm compared to the storm breaking across Elena's face. "You're my real mom. I've been drawing you every night so I wouldn't forget which face to look for in the crowds." The ghost of Case 402, the restaurant, seemed to tilt on its axis. Elena felt the walls of her carefully constructed empire of acquisitions, the billions under management, the Iron Empress persona shatter like cheap glass. 10 years. She had spent 10 years convincing herself that her daughter was a nameless, faceless entity living a generic, happy life in a suburb she would never visit. She had convinced herself that the closed part of the adoption meant the wound was sealed. But here was the wound, sitting across from her in a pink dress, holding a charcoal pencil like a weapon of truth. "Maya, listen to me," Elena stammered, her professional poise completely evaporated. I knew a little girl once, a long time ago. But she went to a family who could give her everything. A family that wasn't like me? You mean a family that wasn't lonely?" Maya asked. The question was a scalpel. It cut through Elena's defenses with terrifying ease. "I have my daddy," Maya continued, her voice softening as she looked toward the door where Mark was still talking on his phone. "He's the best. He rescued me. But he always said that the lady who gave me to him wasn't mean. He said she was just a star that had to stay in the sky for a while." Maya reached across the table and touched Elena's shaking hand. Her skin was warm, vibrant, and terrifyingly real. "The star fell down, didn't it?" Maya whispered. "You're here?" The shadow of the father. Elena looked out the window and saw Mark. He was pacing on the sidewalk. His brow furrowed in concentration as he spoke into his headset. He looked like a good man. A stable man? A man who had spent 7 years raising the child Elena had been too afraid to keep. The irony was a bitter pill. She had gone on this date to satisfy her sister, to perhaps find a distraction from her work. She hadn't realized she was walking into a cosmic ambush. She looked back at the sketch. "Does your father know you draw this?" "He sees the faces," Maya said. "But he doesn't know they're all the same person. He thinks I'm just practicing." "I didn't tell him because I didn't want him to be sad that I was looking for you. He thinks he's enough, and he is." "But you're the other half?" Elena felt a sob rise in her throat, a raw, primal sound she hadn't made since she was a child herself. She forced it down, swallowing the salt and the shame. She was a CEO, she was a strategist, she needed to think. If Maya was right, if this was on some impossible coincidence or a cruel prank by the universe, then Elena was sitting across from the most significant acquisition of her life. But this wasn't a company she could buy or a rival she could crush. This was a soul she had surrendered. The return. The heavy oak doors creaked open and Mark stepped back into the restaurant. He was tucking his phone into his pocket, a look of immense relief on his face. "Crisis averted," he said, sliding back into the booth with a sheepish grin. "The London team just needed a kick in the—" He stopped. He looked at Elena, whose face was the color of ash. Then he looked at Maya, who was calmly closing her sketchbook. Finally, his eyes fell on the open page that Maya hadn't quite hidden yet. Mark's smile didn't just fade, it vanished. He recognized the face in the drawing. He looked at the woman sitting across from him, the woman with the same eyes, the same jawline, the same haunting aura of a secret kept too long. The air in the booth grew heavy enough to choke them both. "Elena?" Mark's voice was a low, cautious rumble. "What does she show you?" Elena couldn't speak. She could only look at Maya, who was now smiling, a small, triumphant smile that said the search is over. "She showed me the truth, Mark," Elena finally whispered, her voice cracking. "She showed me exactly who I am." The waiter arrived at that moment with 2 plates of steaming food, oblivious to the fact that the world at table 4 had just ended and begun at the same time. The clatter of the waiter's tray at L. Heritage was the only sound in the vacuum that had become table 4. The Iron Empress was gone. In her place sat a woman whose entire internal architecture had been demolished by a few strokes of charcoal. Mark looked from the sketch to Elena, his face a mask of dawning, horrific realization. "Elena?" he whispered, his voice thick with a sudden protective edge. "What is this? How could she know these details about you?" Elena didn't answer. Her lungs felt like they were filled with silt. She stood up abruptly, her silk dress rustling like dry leaves. I have to go," she choked out. She didn't look at Mark. She couldn't bear to look at Maya. She fled the restaurant, the cold New York air hitting her face like a physical reprimand for a decade of silence. The paper trail of a hidden life Elena didn't drive home to her sterile penthouse. Instead, she found herself standing in the lobby of Vance Global. The night security guard, a man named Arthur who had worked there for 20 years, blinked in surprise as the CEO stormed past him at 11:30 p.m. Her hair was disheveled and the power red lipstick she had applied so carefully was smeared. She locked herself in her office's 60-floor fortress of glass and steel and went to the floor-to-ceiling wall safe. Her hands shook so violently she missed the combination twice. Finally, the heavy door swung open. She pulled out a thin blue folder labeled Personal, Oakhaven. She spread the papers across her glass desk. There it was, the relinquishment forms from 10 years ago. Case 402, birth weight, 6 pounds, 4 ounces. Eye color, blue. She flipped to the finalization papers, the ones she had signed blindly in a haze of postpartum depression and career-driven panic. Her eyes locked onto the name of the adoptive parent, Mark Theodore Sterling. The room seemed to spin. She had been so focused on erasing the event that she had never truly registered the name of the man who took her child. And Mark, a software architect who avoided the social circles of the ultra-wealthy, would have had no reason to connect the Iron Empress of Wall Street to the ghost of the woman from a private agency. The boardroom confession, a soft knock at her door, made her jump. It was Mark. He was standing in the doorway, Maya asleep in his arms. The little girl's head rested on his shoulder, her hand still clutching the sketchbook. The security guard let me up when I told him it was an emergency, Mark said quietly. He walked to the back of the office and gently laid Maya on the long leather sofa, draping his coat over her. He turned back to Elena, gesturing at the papers on the desk. I spent 7 years wondering who she was. I imagined a woman who was forced into a corner, someone who loved her enough to let her go. I never imagined it was you. Elena, I never imagined that the woman I was falling for tonight was the same one who gave me my greatest joy and my greatest heartbreak. Elena leaned back, her chair creaking in the silent office. I thought I was saving her, Mark. I was 26, my parents had just died, and I was in an industry that eats people alive. I looked at that baby and I didn't see a future. I saw a hostage to my own ambition. I thought if I gave her to someone like you, someone who could actually be there, she'd be safe from the person I was becoming. Safe from you? Mark walked toward the window, looking out at the city lights. Elena, Maya has been drawing your face since she was old enough to hold a crayon. She didn't need to be safe from you. She needed you to find her. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger she missed. The legal and emotional fallout. The days that followed were a chaotic blur of legal consultations and raw, painful conversations. Elena's lawyers were horrified. This is a closed adoption, Elena, her lead counsel Sarah argued. You have no legal standing, and he could sue you for even attempting to contact her outside of this coincidental meeting. I don't care about the legal standing, Sarah, Elena snapped, her voice regaining some of its old authority, though it was now tempered by grief. I want to know how a 7-year-old child drew a birthmark she had never seen. Children have a connection to their biological mothers that science still can't fully map, Sarah said softly, closing her laptop. But the question is, what do you do now? You can't just be mom on Tuesdays. You either stay in her life and change everything, or you leave now and break her heart a second time. Elena realized then that the Iron Empress had to die for Maya to live. She called an emergency board meeting. She didn't resign, but she did the unthinkable. She announced she was stepping back from daily operations to focus on personal matters. The market dipped 4% on the news, but for the first time in her life, Elena didn't care about the ticker tape. Building the bridge, the transition was not a movie montage. It was awkward, painful, and filled with long silences. Elena had to learn how to be real. She started small Saturday mornings at the park with Mark and Maya. At first, Maya was shy. She would sit on the bench next to Elena and draw, occasionally glancing up to see if Elena was still there. Do you like the blue flowers? Maya asked one afternoon, pointing to a patch of hydrangeas. I do, Elena said, her voice catching. They're my favorite. How did you know? I didn't, Maya whispered. I just felt like they belonged to you. Mark stood back, watching them. He was the bridge. He navigated the complex emotions of a father who feared losing his daughter to the woman who gave her life, and the man who was still undeniably attracted to the woman Elena was becoming. She asks about you every night now, Mark told Elena over coffee as Maya played on the swings. She doesn't call you mom yet, but she calls you the star lady. She thinks you finally fell back to earth. The final integration. 3 months after the date at La Heritage, Elena invited Mark and Maya to her penthouse for dinner. She had spent the day decorporatizing the space, buying actual food, putting out pillows that weren't just for show, and displaying the sketches Maya had given her. Maya ran through the halls, her laughter echoing off the marble floors that had previously only known the sound of expensive heels. She stopped at the window, looking out at the skyline. It's high up here, Maya said. Like a nest. It used to be a cage, Elena said, kneeling down beside her. But I think I like nest better. Maya turned and looked at Elena. She reached out and touched the star-shaped birthmark on Elena's neck, which was now visible above her casual sweater. I'm glad I drew you, Elena. If I didn't draw you, you might have stayed lost. Elena pulled the girl into a hug. It wasn't the tentative hug of a stranger. It was the fierce, desperate embrace of a mother reclaiming her soul. Over Maya's shoulder, she saw Mark leaning against the doorway, a look of profound peace on his face. They weren't a traditional family. They were a collection of broken pieces that had found a way to fit together. Elena Vance still ran a multi-billion-dollar empire, but her most important meeting was now at 4 p.m. Every day, a meeting with a sketchbook, a cup of juice, and the daughter who had seen through the glass tower to the woman inside. The Iron Empress was gone. In her place was a woman who knew that the most valuable asset in the world wasn't gold or data, it was the moment a child looks at you and finally sees home. The transition from being a solitary titan of industry to a woman woven into the fabric of a family was not an overnight evolution. It was a slow, sometimes painful reconstruction of Elena's entire identity. If the previous months were about the shock of discovery and the fragility of the first meetings, Part 4 was about the weight of permanence and the courage to build a future on a foundation of truth. The shattered glass. The first major change was visible in the very architecture of Elena's life. The penthouse, once a stark gallery of cold marble and expensive silence, began to breathe. A yellow raincoat now hung on the mahogany coat rack. A pair of scuffed sneakers sat by the door. The Iron Empress had traded her silence for the rhythmic, chaotic soundtrack of a 7-year-old's curiosity. Elena found herself standing in her office at Vance Global, looking at a quarterly report that, only a year ago, would have been the center of her universe. Now, the numbers felt flat. Her mind kept drifting to the parent-teacher conference she had scheduled for 3 p.m. "You're distracted." "Elena," Chloe said, walking into the office without an appointment. Elena's sister looked around at the office, noting the framed drawing on the desk, Maya's sketch of the Star Lady. "I'm not distracted, Chloe, I'm prioritized," Elena replied, a small, genuine smile tugging at her lips. "The board is whispering," Chloe warned, sitting across from her. "They say you've lost your edge. They say the merger with Kenzo Tech is stalling because you read never in the office past 5. Elena leaned back in her chair. "Let them whisper. I spent 10 years building this firm so I wouldn't have to feel anything. Now that I do, I realize that the edge they're talking about was just a wall. I don't need the wall anymore. The shadow of the past, despite the burgeoning happiness. A shadow remained, the legal and moral complexity of their situation. Mark and Elena had agreed to a shared life, but the legal reality of the closed adoption still loomed. One evening, after Maya had fallen asleep, Mark and Elena sat on the balcony of the penthouse. The city hummed below them, a sea of lights that seemed less like a battlefield and more like a playground. "We need to talk about the M word," Mark said softly, staring into his drink. Elena felt a familiar tightening in her chest. "Mom?" "No," Mark said, looking at her. "Marriage. And the legalities of Maya. If we're going to do this, Elena, if we're going to be a family, we have to decide what that looks like on paper. Right now, you're a family friend who looks exactly like her. The world is going to start asking questions." Elena knew he was right. The press had already begun to sniff around. A CEO of her stature dating a single father was one thing. The uncanny resemblance between the CEO and the daughter was another. "I'm terrified, Mark," Elena confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm terrified that if we try to make it official, the ghost will come back. What if the agency challenges it? What if the public decides I'm a monster for giving her up in the first place?" Mark reached across the table and took her hand. His grip was steady, the anchor she had never known she needed. "We aren't hiding anymore, Elena. We're building a bridge. And bridges are meant to be walked on, even when it's windy." The public disclosure, the decision to go public, was not made lightly. Elena decided that instead of letting the tabloids dictate the narrative, she would control it one last CEO move, but this time it was for love, not profit. She sat for an interview with a prominent business magazine, but she didn't talk about market shares. She talked about the cost of ambition. She spoke about the girl in the pink dress and the sketch that changed her life. "I was a woman who thought success was a substitute for a soul," Elena told the reporter. "I was wrong. My greatest achievement isn't the company I built. It's the daughter who found me." The fallout was immediate and polarized. Some called her a hero for her honesty. Others, as she feared, were cruel. But inside the nest, the noise of the world didn't matter. The first holiday, the true test of their new reality, came with the first Christmas. Elena had never done Christmas. Usually she spent the day in the office, taking advantage of the quiet to catch up on global markets. This year, the penthouse was dominated by a 12-foot fir tree that smelled of pine and redemption. Mark and Maya arrived on Christmas Eve, laden with boxes of ornaments that were clearly handmade and slightly lopsided. "You can't just have white lights, Elena," Maya insisted, shaking her head at the sophisticated, monochrome tree. "It needs color. It needs soul." Elena watched as Mark hoisted Maya onto his shoulders so she could reach the higher branches. She saw the way Mark looked at Maya with a fierce, uncomplicated devotion, and the way he looked at Elena, as if she were the missing piece of a puzzle he had been solving for a decade. That night, after the cocoa had been drunk and the cookies left for Santa, Maya pulled Elena aside. "I have a new drawing," Maya said, handing her a small, folded piece of paper. Elena opened it. It was a drawing of the three of them, but this time they weren't on a beach. They were in this room, by this tree. And for the first time, Maya had written a word at the bottom of the page in careful, block letters. "Family." "Do you like it?" Maya asked, her blue eyes wide with hope. Elena couldn't speak. She just pulled the girl into a hug, the Iron Empress completely dissolved in the warmth of a child's forgiveness. The bridge completed. The story of the CEO and the single dad ended not with a merger, but with a quiet ceremony in the park where they had spent so many Saturdays. It wasn't a media event. It was a small gathering of the people who mattered, Chloe, a few close friends, and the three of them. As Elena stood across from Mark, she realized that her life had been a series of acquisitions, but this was a gift. She wasn't just a CEO. She was a wife, a partner, and most importantly, she was the woman Maya had been drawing all those years. When the officiant asked if there were any final words, Maya stepped forward. She wasn't shy anymore. She looked at the small crowd and then at Elena. "My dad says that stars stay in the sky so we can find our way home," Maya said. "I found my star, and she's not lost anymore." Elena Vance, the woman who had once built a tower of glass to hide from the world, finally understood what true power was. It wasn't in the billions she managed or the companies she owned. It was in the small, warm hand of a daughter who had never given up on her, and the man who had the courage to let her back in. The bridge was finished, and as they walked across it together, Elena knew that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be.